Think you'd want to live in ancient Rome? The glorious empire with marble statues, noble senators, and mighty gladiators? Stop right there. Forget everything Hollywood and history class taught you about Roman civilization. The real ancient Rome was a nightmare that would break your mind and kill your body in ways you can't imagine. We're talking about a society so brutal, so diseased, and so psychologically twisted that it makes medieval times look like a luxury resort. You've been lied to about Rome. The marble buildings you see in movies. Most Romans lived in collapsing slums. The noble senators, psychopathic murderers who tortured people for entertainment. The mighty empire, built on industrial-scale slavery and genocide that killed millions. Today, we're diving into the real ancient Rome, not the sanitized, romanticized version from Gladiator or history textbooks, but the horrifying reality where human life was cheaper than dirt and suffering was the national pastime. You think modern life is hard? By the end of this deep dive, you'll be kissing the ground that you live in the 21st century instead of the Roman hellscape that consumed human lives like a wood chipper for over 1,000 years. Welcome to your first day as a regular Roman citizen. Congratulations! You're about to experience living conditions that would be considered torture by modern standards. You wake up in a tenement building called an insula, a 5 or 6 story death trap made of cheap wood and brick that's ready to collapse at any moment. These buildings were so poorly constructed that they regularly fell down, crushing everyone inside. Imagine living in a building where the floors above you are sagging from the weight, walls are cracking, and you can hear every beam groaning under stress. Your apartment is one room that you share with your entire family. There's no running water, no toilet, no kitchen, and definitely no privacy. 8 people might be crammed into a space the size of a modern bedroom, sleeping on straw mats on a dirt floor. The smell is indescribable. Unwashed bodies, human waste, rotting food, and the stench of the city streets below. But wait, it gets worse, much worse. There's no plumbing in your building, so everyone uses chamber pots that are emptied by throwing the contents out the window into the street below. That's right, human waste was literally thrown from windows, and if you were unlucky enough to be walking by when someone emptied their pot, you'd be covered in excrement. The streets of Rome were rivers of human and animal waste, garbage, and rotting organic matter. The noise is absolutely unbearable. Roman law actually prohibited wheeled traffic during the day because the noise was so intense, but this just meant that all the heavy wagons, construction work, and commercial transport happened at night. So you'd spend your days listening to people shouting, arguing, fighting, and conducting business, then spend your nights listening to iron wheels grinding over stone streets, oxen bellowing, and workers hammering and sawing. Fire was a constant, terrifying threat. These wooden tenements were essentially kindling waiting for a spark. Oil lamps provided the only lighting, and when one tipped over, which happened regularly, entire city blocks could burn down in hours. The Great Fire of 64 AD destroyed most of Rome, but smaller fires happened constantly. Imagine trying to sleep, knowing that a single accident could trap you in a burning building with no fire department to save you. Let's talk about the water situation, because it perfectly illustrates how Rome's famous engineering was great for the wealthy, but a nightmare for everyone else. Yes, Rome had aqueducts bringing fresh water to the city, but that water went to public fountains, baths, and the homes of the rich. Regular people had to carry water up 5 flights of stairs in heavy clay jugs multiple times per day, just to have enough for drinking and basic washing. The public latrines were communal nightmares where dozens of people sat side by side on wooden benches with holes, sharing communal sponges on sticks instead of toilet paper. These sponges were just rinsed in buckets of salt water and reused by the next person. Disease spread like wildfire in these conditions, and going to the bathroom was a social activity where you'd sit inches away from strangers while handling contaminated cleaning materials. Food was another daily horror show. Most people couldn't afford to cook in their apartments. Remember, no kitchens. So they bought prepared food from street vendors who sold meals of dubious quality and safety. The Roman diet for poor people consisted mainly of bread made from wheat that was often moldy or contaminated with ergot, a fungus that causes hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Fish sauce called garum was the ketchup of ancient Rome, made by letting fish guts rot in the sun for months until they liquefied into a putrid paste. This rotting fish sauce was added to everything and was probably crawling with bacteria that would hospitalize modern people. Meat was often spoiled by the time it reached consumers, and there was no refrigeration to preserve anything. The bread that formed the foundation of most Romans' diet was baked in communal ovens that were rarely cleaned and often contaminated with rat droppings, insect parts, and other filth. Bakers regularly added chalk, beans, or even sawdust to stretch the flour and increase profits. Poor people often ate bread that was more chalk and sawdust than actual grain. Wine was safer to drink than water in many cases, but Roman wine was often contaminated with lead because it was stored and transported in lead-lined containers. Lead poisoning was epidemic among Romans, causing mental illness, physical deterioration, and death. The wealthy Romans who drank the most wine often suffered the worst lead poisoning, which may explain some of the insane behavior of Roman emperors. Personal hygiene was a luxury most Romans couldn't afford. Soap didn't exist in the way we know it. Romans used olive oil and a scraping tool called a strigil to clean themselves, but this was expensive and time-consuming. Most people went weeks without bathing, and their clothes were rarely washed. The smell of unwashed bodies was so overwhelming that Romans used heavy perfumes and incense to mask it, but this just created a nauseating mixture of body odor and artificial scents. Dental care was primitive and horrifying. Toothache was treated by extracting teeth with crude pliers without anesthesia. Most Romans had terrible teeth, abscessed gums, and chronic pain from dental problems. Breath was so universally foul that chewing aromatic herbs was a necessity for anyone who wanted to have a conversation. Sleep was nearly impossible between the noise, overcrowding, and constant threat of fire, collapse, or crime. Most Romans were chronically sleep-deprived, which made them irritable and prone to violence. The combination of poor nutrition, lack of sleep, constant stress, and terrible living conditions created a population that was perpetually on edge and ready to explode into violence at the slightest provocation. Roman children lived in these same conditions, but had even fewer protections and resources. Child mortality was astronomical. Probably 30 to 40% of children died before age 5. Those who survived often suffered from malnutrition, disease, and injuries that would be easily treatable today. Children worked from an early age because families needed every possible source of income to survive. Education was available only to the wealthy. Poor children learned whatever skills they could pick up from their parents or from working, but formal education was completely out of reach. Literacy rates among the poor were probably less than 10%, leaving most Romans unable to read laws, contracts, or even basic signs. The legal system offered no protection for ordinary Romans. Justice was purchased by the wealthy, and poor people had no recourse when they were cheated, robbed, or abused. Slavery was legal and common, and even free Romans could be enslaved for debt or minor crimes. The threat of enslavement hung over every poor Roman's head as a constant reminder of how precarious their freedom was. Medical care was primitive, dangerous, and expensive. Roman doctors had no understanding of germ theory, anatomy, or proper medical procedures. Common treatments included bloodletting, trepanation, drilling holes in skulls, and administering toxic substances like mercury and lead. Many people died from the treatments rather than their original illnesses. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, using crude tools that weren't sterilized. Patients were held down while surgeons cut, sawed, and cauterized with hot irons. The survival rate for major surgery was probably less than 50%, and survivors often died later from infections caused by unsanitary conditions and procedures. Women faced additional hardships, including extremely dangerous childbirth with no prenatal care or safe delivery methods. Maternal mortality was probably around 10 to 15%, meaning that every pregnancy was literally a life-or-death gamble. Women who survived multiple pregnancies often suffered from permanent injuries, chronic pain, and early death from complications. The Romans you see in movies, clean, well-dressed, living in beautiful villas, represented maybe 1 to 2% of the population. The other 98% lived in conditions that would be considered uninhabitable by modern standards. They were malnourished, diseased, sleep-deprived, and constantly threatened by fire, building collapse, crime, and economic disaster. Mental illness was common, but completely misunderstood. People with psychological problems were often thought to be possessed by demons or cursed by gods. treatment involved exorcism, beatings, or being chained up like animals. The stress of Roman urban life, combined with lead poisoning, malnutrition, and trauma, created widespread mental health problems that had no effective treatment. The contrast between rich and poor was so extreme, it was almost like different species living in the same city. While wealthy Romans lived in spacious houses with gardens, private baths, and dozens of slaves to attend their every need, poor Romans lived like animals in overcrowded, dangerous, filthy conditions that would violate every modern health and safety code. This daily reality of Roman life, the constant hunger, disease, danger, and degradation, was what most people in the empire experienced every single day. The glorious marble buildings and triumphant military parades existed alongside human misery on a scale that's difficult for modern people to comprehend. And this was just ordinary daily life. We haven't even talked about the wars, the political purges, the gladiator games, the religious persecution, or the systematic brutality that defined Roman culture. The everyday horror of simply trying to survive in ancient Rome was just the baseline of suffering that everything else was built on top of. Roman civilization wasn't the pinnacle of human achievement that historians often portray. It was a sophisticated system for concentrating wealth and power while subjecting the majority of the population to living conditions that were barely better than those of domestic animals. The empire's greatest achievement wasn't architecture or law. It was creating a stable system for extracting maximum labor and resources from human beings while providing them with just enough to survive and reproduce the next generation of workers. Roman slavery wasn't just part of their society, it was their society. The entire empire was built on a foundation of human bondage so massive and brutal that it dwarfs anything in modern history. We're talking about 30 to 40% of the population being literal property, treated worse than farm animals, and subjected to horrors that would traumatize modern people just to hear about. Let's start with the numbers, because they're absolutely staggering. At the height of the Roman Empire, there were probably 6 to 8 million slaves in Italy alone, out of a total population of maybe 20 million. That means that in any Roman city, every third or fourth person you saw was someone's property who could be bought, sold, tortured, or killed at their owner's whim. But these weren't just statistics. These were human beings who had been torn from their families, transported in conditions that killed many of them, and then forced into lives of unimaginable suffering. Roman slavery was an industrial-scale system of human trafficking and exploitation that operated for over 1,000 years. The process of becoming a slave was itself a horror show. Most slaves were captured during Rome's constant wars of conquest. When Roman legions conquered a city or region, they would systematically round up the surviving population, men, women, children, entire families, and march them hundreds or thousands of miles to slave markets where they would be sold like livestock. These forced marches killed enormous numbers of people. Slaves were chained together in long lines called coffles and forced to walk for weeks or months with minimal food, water, or rest. Those who became sick, injured, or too weak to continue were simply killed and left by the roadside. Families were deliberately separated to break their spirits and prevent resistance. The slave markets themselves were scenes of unthinkable cruelty. Humans were displayed naked, examined like animals, and sold to the highest bidder. Families watched as their children were sold to different owners, knowing they would probably never see them again. The psychological trauma of these auctions broke many people completely, which was exactly the point. Once sold, slaves entered a world where they had absolutely no rights, no legal protections, and no hope of justice. Roman law explicitly stated that slaves were talking tools, property that happened to be able to speak. Masters could do literally anything to their slaves without legal consequences. They could torture, rape, kill, or sell their slaves for any reason or no reason at all. The working conditions for Roman slaves were deliberately designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimal care. Agricultural slaves, who made up the largest group, worked from dawn to dusk in all weather conditions, often chained together to prevent escape. They lived in underground barracks called ergastula that were essentially dungeons where slaves were locked up at night. These ergastula were hellholes where slaves were packed together in darkness, with minimal ventilation, no sanitation, and barely enough food to survive. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions, and many slaves died from infections, malnutrition, or simple despair. The mortality rate among agricultural slaves was so high that constant replacement was necessary just to maintain the workforce. Mining slaves had it even worse, if that's possible. Roman mines were death traps, where slaves were forced to work in narrow, unstable tunnels with primitive tools and no safety equipment. Cave-ins, floods, and toxic gases killed thousands of mining slaves every year. The average lifespan of a slave sent to the mines was probably less than 2 years. The psychological torture was as systematic as the physical abuse. Slaves were given degrading names, forced to wear identifying collars, and subjected to constant humiliation, designed to break their spirits. Slave children were raised knowing they were property, that they had no future beyond serving their masters, and that resistance would result in horrific punishment. Sexual slavery was routine and accepted. Both male and female slaves could be used sexually by their masters or rented out to others for profit. Slave women were bred like livestock to produce more slaves, with no say in who they mated with or what happened to their children. Slave children belonged to the master and could be sold away from their parents at any time. The punishments for disobedience were designed to terrorize other slaves into submission. Crucifixion was commonly used for runaway slaves, but that was just one option among many. Slaves could be beaten to death, burned alive, fed to wild animals, or tortured in creative ways that served as examples to others. The most famous example of mass slave punishment occurred after Spartacus's rebellion was crushed. 6,000 captured slaves were crucified along the Appian Way, creating a 120-mile corridor of dying humans, whose screams and pleas for mercy could be heard by travelers for days. The crosses were left up until the bodies rotted away, serving as a permanent reminder of what happened to slaves who dared to resist. But individual punishments could be just as horrific. Masters who suspected slaves of theft might torture them for days to extract confessions. Hot irons, thumb screws, and other torture devices were commonly used on slaves for minor infractions. Some masters kept slaves chained in their homes as permanent prisoners, releasing them only to work. The Roman legal system not only permitted this abuse, but actively encouraged it. Slaves could not testify in court unless they were tortured first, because Romans believed that only under torture would slaves tell the truth. This meant that any legal proceeding involving slaves automatically included torture as a standard procedure. Even freed slaves weren't truly free. The manumission process created freedmen who still owed obligations to their former masters and could be re-enslaved for certain offenses. Many freedmen discovered that their freedom was just another form of bondage with slightly better living conditions. The economic system of the Roman Empire was completely dependent on slave labor. Agriculture, manufacturing, construction, domestic service, and even skilled professions like medicine and education relied heavily on slaves. Free Romans often couldn't compete economically with slave labor, creating unemployment and social problems that contributed to the empire's instability. Gladiator slaves represent perhaps the most famous but misunderstood aspect of Roman slavery. Hollywood portrays gladiators as heroic fighters, but the reality was that they were prisoners, forced to fight to the death for public entertainment. Most gladiators died within 2 years of entering the arena, and those who survived were usually permanently disabled by their injuries. The training of gladiators was itself a form of systematic torture. They were kept in barracks that were essentially prisons, fed just enough to maintain their fighting strength, and subjected to constant physical and psychological abuse designed to make them more vicious fighters. Many gladiators committed suicide rather than continue living under these conditions. The arena games weren't just entertainment, they were public demonstrations of Roman power over life and death. The crowds didn't just watch gladiators kill each other, they watched hundreds of slaves being executed in creative ways between the main events. Slaves were burned alive, torn apart by wild animals, or forced to reenact famous battles where they were guaranteed to die. Roman households were completely dependent on domestic slaves who handled every aspect of daily life for wealthy families. These slaves might have better living conditions than agricultural or mining slaves, but they were subject to constant surveillance and had no privacy or personal life. Their entire existence revolved around serving their masters' needs and whims. Child slaves were particularly vulnerable to abuse because they had no protections even among the slave population. Children could be bought specifically for sexual purposes, used as expendable labor in dangerous work, or simply killed if they became inconvenient. The Roman legal system provided no special protections for children, slave or free. The psychological impact of slavery on Roman society extended beyond the slaves themselves. Living in a society where human beings were treated as disposable property normalized violence and dehumanization in ways that affected everyone. Romans became accustomed to viewing certain categories of people as inherently less valuable, which made it easier to justify other forms of cruelty and oppression. Slave revolts were rare, not because conditions were tolerable, but because they were so hopeless that resistance seemed impossible. The few major slave revolts that did occur were suppressed with extraordinary brutality that served as warnings to future generations. The Roman response to slave resistance was always massive retaliation designed to prevent future uprisings. The capture and enslavement of free Romans was also a constant threat that hung over the lower classes. Debt slavery was legal, meaning that free citizens could become slaves if they couldn't pay their obligations. Pirates and raiders regularly captured Romans and sold them into slavery, sometimes in the same markets where Romans bought foreign slaves. Roman engineering and architecture, which are often admired today, were built entirely with slave labor. The Colosseum, aqueducts, roads, and temples that tourists visit were constructed by enslaved workers who were literally worked to death in their construction. Every magnificent Roman building represents thousands of human lives that were consumed in its creation. The cultural impact of slavery shaped Roman literature, philosophy, and religion in ways that justified and normalized the system. Roman writers regularly describe slaves as naturally inferior beings who were better off in bondage than free. This intellectual framework provided moral cover for a system that would otherwise have been recognized as monstrous. Even Roman religion was twisted to support slavery. Gods were said to approve of the natural hierarchy that placed some people in bondage to others. Religious festivals often included slave sacrifices or ritualized abuse of slaves as offerings to the gods. The Christian message of human equality was seen as dangerous precisely because it challenged the fundamental assumptions of Roman slave society. The end of Roman slavery didn't come through moral awakening or humanitarian reform. It collapsed along with the empire itself when the economic and military systems that maintained it became unsustainable. The barbarian tribes that conquered Roman territories often had less hierarchical social systems and couldn't maintain the complex infrastructure required for mass slavery. The legacy of Roman slavery influenced European and American slavery systems for centuries afterward. The legal frameworks, economic structures, and ideological justifications developed by Romans were adapted and used to justify later forms of human bondage, including the Atlantic slave trade and plantation slavery in the Americas. Understanding the true scope and brutality of Roman slavery is essential for understanding how Roman civilization actually functioned. The marble statues, impressive architecture, and philosophical writings that we associate with Roman culture were all products of a society built on systematic human exploitation that operated on a scale that wouldn't be matched again until the industrial slave systems of the modern era. Roman entertainment wasn't just violent, it was industrial-scale murder designed as public spectacle. What we call games were actually systematic programs of human sacrifice that killed hundreds of thousands of people for the amusement of crowds who cheered louder for more creative methods of death. The Colosseum, that iconic symbol of Roman civilization, was essentially a purpose-built slaughterhouse where human beings were killed in increasingly elaborate ways for public entertainment. But it wasn't just one building. Every major Roman city had amphitheaters where similar massacres took place regularly. We're talking about a civilization that made mass murder its primary form of entertainment. Let's start with the gladiator fights, because even these sporting events were far more brutal than Hollywood depicts. Gladiators weren't heroic warriors fighting for glory. They were slaves, prisoners of war, and condemned criminals forced to kill each other while crowds bet on who would die first and how. The training of gladiators was systematic torture designed to turn human beings into killing machines. They were kept in barracks called ludus that were essentially prisons where they lived under constant guard. The training involved not just learning to fight, but learning to die entertainingly. Gladiators were taught specific ways to fall, how to beg for mercy that might or might not be granted, and how to make their deaths as dramatic as possible for the crowd. Most gladiators died within 2 years of entering the arena. Those who survived longer were usually permanently disabled by their injuries. The medical care available to gladiators was designed to keep them alive long enough to fight again, not to actually heal them. Many gladiators suffered from chronic pain, infected wounds, and disabilities that made their daily lives agony. The fights themselves were choreographed death matches where the outcome was often predetermined. Some gladiators were equipped with weapons and armor, while their opponents were given inferior gear, ensuring that certain fighters would die for the entertainment of specific sections of the crowd. The thumbs up or thumbs down decision about whether to spare a defeated gladiator was made by the crowd, but emperors often overruled popular decisions to demonstrate their absolute power over life and death. But gladiator fights were just the warm-up act. The real mass slaughter happened during the beast hunts and public executions that filled the time between main events. These weren't quick, merciful deaths. They were prolonged torture sessions designed to maximize the victim's suffering for the crowd's entertainment. The beast hunts involved releasing hundreds of wild animals into the arena along with condemned prisoners who were given no weapons or protection. Lions, tigers, bears, elephants, and other predators would tear apart helpless humans while crowds cheered and placed bets on how long each victim would survive. The arena floor had to be constantly raked and resanded to soak up the blood and remove body parts. But simply feeding people to animals wasn't creative enough for Roman audiences. Executions were often staged as mythological reenactments, where condemned prisoners would be forced to play the roles of mythological figures who died horribly. Someone might be dressed as Icarus and then burned alive, or forced to play Orpheus before being torn apart by wild animals. Crucifixion was performed as public entertainment, with victims nailed to crosses in the arena, where crowds could watch them die slowly over hours or days. The Romans had perfected crucifixion as a method of execution that maximized suffering while prolonging death. Victims were often tortured before being crucified, then left to die of exposure, blood loss, and gradual suffocation as their bodies sagged against the nails. Mass drownings were another popular form of entertainment. The arena could be flooded with water, and condemned prisoners would be forced to fight mock naval battles called naumachiae, where the losers would be allowed to drown, while winners might be spared to fight another day. These naval battles sometimes involved hundreds of participants, most of whom were expected to die for the crowd's amusement. Fire was frequently used as an execution method that provided spectacular visual entertainment. Prisoners would be covered in pitch or oil and then set ablaze while still alive. Some were forced to wear shirts soaked in flammable substances that would burn slowly, prolonging their agony. The screams of burning victims were considered part of the entertainment. The scale of slaughter at Roman games was absolutely staggering. The opening ceremonies for the Colosseum lasted 100 days and killed an estimated 9,000 animals and 5,000 humans. Individual games might kill hundreds of people in a single day. Over the course of the Roman Empire, millions of human beings were killed in arenas for entertainment purposes. Emperors competed to put on more elaborate and deadly games as a way of demonstrating their power and wealth. Trajan's victory celebration after conquering Dacia lasted 123 days and killed 11,000 animals and thousands of human beings. These weren't occasional events. They were regular occurrences that consumed enormous resources and countless lives. The logistics of Roman entertainment required vast networks for capturing animals and humans for slaughter. Professional animal hunters scoured the empire and beyond for exotic beasts that could be brought to Rome for the games. Entire species were driven to extinction to supply Roman arenas. Lions disappeared from North Africa, elephants from North Africa and parts of Asia, and various other animals were hunted to local extinction. The human victims came from every corner of the empire. Prisoners of war, slaves, criminals, and sometimes even volunteers who were desperate enough to risk death for the small chance of winning freedom were fed into the arena system. Some games specifically targeted certain ethnic or religious groups as a form of public humiliation and genocide. Christians were famously martyred in Roman arenas, but they were just one group among many. Jews, Germans, Britons, and other conquered peoples were regularly used as arena fodder. These executions served multiple purposes: entertainment, demonstration of Roman power, and elimination of potentially troublesome populations. The crowd participation in these events was as disturbing as the violence itself. Romans didn't just watch passively, they actively participated by cheering for specific deaths, booing when they thought a victim was dying too quickly, and demanding more creative forms of execution. The bloodlust of Roman crowds was legendary even in ancient times. Women attended these events alongside men, and were often more vocal in demanding spectacular deaths. Roman sources describe aristocratic women shrieking with delight as they watched prisoners being torn apart by wild animals. Children were brought to games as part of their education in Roman values. Learning to enjoy the suffering of others was considered character building. The economic impact of Roman entertainment was enormous. The games employed thousands of people: animal trainers, gladiator trainers, arena workers, guards, and specialized executioners who knew how to kill people in entertaining ways. Entire industries developed around supplying victims, animals, weapons, and other materials needed for mass slaughter. Betting on the games was a major economic activity that involved all levels of Roman society. People would bet not just on who would win fights, but on specific details of how people would die. Would a gladiator be killed with a sword thrust or have his throat cut? How long would someone last against a lion? Would a crucified prisoner die before sunset? This gambling turned human death into a commodity that generated enormous profits. The social pressure to attend and enjoy the games was intense. Romans who showed squeamishness or refused to attend were viewed with suspicion as potentially disloyal or un-Roman. Enjoying brutal spectacles was considered a mark of proper Roman character, while expressing sympathy for victims was seen as weakness or foreign influence. Politicians used the games as a form of mass bribery, putting on elaborate spectacles to win popular support. The phrase bread and circuses referred to the way Roman leaders kept the population pacified with free food and spectacular entertainment that distracted from political and economic problems. The more desperate the political situation, the more elaborate and deadly the games became. The religious aspect of Roman games added another layer of horror to the proceedings. Many games were held in honor of gods who were thought to require blood sacrifice. The deaths in the arena weren't just entertainment, they were religious offerings that supposedly ensured divine favor for Rome. This religious framework helped justify the mass killing by portraying it as necessary for the empire's survival. Gladiator schools became breeding grounds for rebellion because the conditions were so horrific that death in battle seemed preferable to continued slavery. The revolt led by Spartacus began in a gladiator school where the conditions had become unbearable even by Roman standards. But most potential revolts were discovered and crushed before they could begin, with the conspirators being fed to animals as entertainment. The psychological impact of attending these events regularly shaped Roman character in profound ways. Growing up watching people die horribly for entertainment normalized violence and cruelty in ways that affected all aspects of Roman society. Romans became accustomed to viewing human suffering as amusing, which made it easier to justify slavery, military brutality, and political oppression. Private games held in wealthy Romans' homes often featured even more extreme violence than public spectacles because they didn't need to worry about public order or political consequences. Rich Romans would have prisoners killed at dinner parties, force slaves to fight to the death for dessert entertainment, or stage elaborate torture sessions for their guests' amusement. Children's games often mimicked arena spectacles, with young Romans playing at being gladiators or executioners. This childhood exposure to simulated violence prepared them for adult participation in real violence. Archaeological evidence shows that children were given toy weapons and trained to enjoy combat from an early age. The medical knowledge gained from treating gladiator injuries was one of the few positive outcomes of the arena system, but even this came at an enormous human cost. Roman doctors learned about anatomy and trauma treatment by working on fighters who were seen as expendable test subjects. Medical advances were literally paid for with the lives of enslaved gladiators. Foreign visitors to Rome were often shocked by the brutality of Roman entertainment, but Romans took pride in their ability to enjoy spectacles that other cultures found horrifying. The capacity To watch human beings die horribly without flinching was seen as evidence of Roman superiority and toughness. Other cultures were viewed as weak precisely because they couldn't stomach Roman-style entertainment. The decline of the games came not from moral awakening, but from economic and military pressures that made them too expensive to maintain. As the empire struggled with invasions and economic problems, the resources needed to capture animals and stage elaborate spectacles became harder to obtain. Christianity's rise also provided an alternative value system that condemned rather than glorified human suffering. The final games in the Colosseum took place in the 6th century AD, but by then the scale of slaughter had already diminished significantly. The end of the arena system marked one of the few clear improvements in human civilization, the elimination of institutionalized mass murder as public entertainment. The legacy of Roman entertainment shows how civilized societies can normalize and even celebrate extreme cruelty when it serves political and economic purposes. The same culture that produced magnificent art, literature, and architecture also created systematic programs for killing human beings as spectacle, demonstrating that technological and cultural sophistication don't necessarily lead to moral progress. Roman military success wasn't built on superior tactics or equipment. It was built on systematic brutality that made resistance so horrifying that entire populations surrendered rather than face Roman justice. The Roman legions weren't just armies. They were organized terror machines designed to break the will of anyone who opposed Roman expansion. The training of Roman soldiers was designed to strip away human empathy and replace it with mechanical obedience to orders, no matter how brutal. New recruits underwent months of conditioning that included practicing sword techniques on human prisoners, participating in executions, and gradually becoming desensitized to inflicting pain and death on other human beings. Roman military discipline was legendary, but it was maintained through terror rather than loyalty. Soldiers who showed cowardice, disobedience, or failure in battle faced decimation, literally being killed by their own comrades. In decimation, every 10th soldier in a unit would be selected by lot and beaten to death by the other 9, regardless of their individual guilt or innocence. This meant that Roman soldiers lived in constant fear, not just of enemy weapons, but of their own officers and fellow soldiers. The psychological pressure of knowing that any failure could result in execution by their own comrades created a form of military organization that prioritized ruthless efficiency over human welfare. But the real horror of Roman warfare wasn't what happened to Roman soldiers. It was what Roman armies did to everyone else. Roman military doctrine explicitly called for the complete destruction of enemy populations as a way of preventing future resistance. This wasn't collateral damage or the unfortunate side effect of warfare. It was deliberate policy designed to terrorize entire regions into submission. When Roman armies conquered a city, the standard procedure was systematic massacre, followed by enslavement of survivors. Men of fighting age were typically killed immediately, while women and children were sold into slavery. But before the killing began, Roman soldiers would often spend days torturing prisoners to extract information about hidden wealth or to simply terrorize other cities into surrendering without resistance. The siege of Carthage in 146 BC provides a perfect example of Roman military brutality. After a 3-year siege, Roman forces finally broke into the city and proceeded to kill every person they could find: men, women, children, elderly, and infants. The massacre continued for 6 days straight, with Roman soldiers systematically going house by house to ensure no one survived. But killing everyone wasn't enough. The Romans then burned the entire city to the ground and scattered salt over the ruins to ensure that nothing could ever grow there again. They literally erased Carthage from existence as a warning to other cities about what happened to those who resisted Rome too strongly. This pattern was repeated across the empire. When Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, his campaigns killed an estimated 1 million Gauls and enslaved another million, roughly 1/3 of the entire population. Entire tribes were wiped out completely, their names surviving only in Caesar's own accounts of his genocidal campaigns. The Roman siege techniques were specifically designed to maximize civilian suffering. Rather than try to win quick victories, Roman armies would surround cities and slowly starve the population to death while preventing anyone from escaping. These Siege by starvation campaigns could last for months or years, during which time the trapped population would resort to cannibalism to survive. Roman soldiers were trained to view enemy civilians as legitimate targets for any form of violence or abuse. Rape was not just tolerated, but encouraged as a way of terrorizing conquered populations. Roman armies moved with trains of camp followers that included professional torturers, executioners, and slave dealers who specialized in processing captured civilians for maximum profit. The crucifixion of thousands of slaves after Spartacus's rebellion wasn't unusual. It was standard Roman practice for dealing with any form of large-scale resistance. Mass crucifixion was used to create corridors of dying people that would serve as warnings to future generations about the consequences of opposing Rome. Roman soldiers were given specific training and torture techniques that would extract information while keeping victims alive long enough to provide useful intelligence. These techniques included burning, flaying, amputation, and various forms of sexual torture that were designed to break the victim's will to resist. The logistics of Roman warfare required enormous resources dedicated to instruments of torture and execution. Roman armies carried portable crucifixion equipment, torture devices, and specialized tools for conducting mass executions. The fact that these implements were considered essential military equipment shows how central brutality was to Roman military strategy. Roman naval warfare was equally brutal, with captured enemy ships being used for mass drownings and water torture. Prisoners taken in naval battles were often thrown overboard with weights attached to their feet, or forced to row Roman galleys until they died from exhaustion. The use of slave rowers in Roman warships meant that naval battles often involved thousands of enslaved men chained to oars who would drown if their ships were sunk. The Roman practice of harrying involved sending troops to systematically destroy all food sources, water supplies, and shelter in enemy territory. This wasn't military strategy. It was deliberate starvation warfare designed to kill civilian populations through hunger and exposure. Entire regions would be turned into uninhabitable wastelands where nothing could survive. Roman military engineers became experts at destroying infrastructure in ways that would cause maximum long-term suffering. They would poison wells, burn crops, destroy irrigation systems, and tear down buildings in ways that would make it impossible for populations to recover after Roman armies moved on. This systematic destruction ensured that conquered territories would remain weak and dependent on Roman administration. The psychological warfare employed by Roman armies was as systematic as their physical brutality. They would display the severed heads of enemy leaders on spears, crucify prisoners in sight of besieged cities, and conduct public torture sessions designed to break the morale of defenders. The goal was to make resistance seem so hopeless that enemies would surrender rather than fight. Roman soldiers were rewarded for creativity in inflicting suffering on enemies. Officers who devised particularly effective torture techniques or execution methods would be promoted and given additional resources. This created an incentive system that encouraged innovation and brutality and made Roman armies increasingly efficient at causing human suffering. The supply lines that supported Roman armies included specialized units for managing prisoners, conducting executions, and processing enslaved populations. These units had their own equipment, training, and procedures that were as organized and professional as any other aspect of Roman military organization. Roman military medicine was advanced not because Romans cared about preserving life, but because they needed to keep their torture victims alive long enough to extract useful information. Roman army doctors became experts at treating wounds and injuries in ways that would allow continued interrogation and torture rather than healing or relieving suffering. The veteran bonuses that Roman soldiers received often included shares of enslaved prisoners and loot taken from conquered populations. This created a direct financial incentive for soldiers to participate enthusiastically in massacres and slave raids, since their retirement security depended on successful brutalization of civilian populations. Roman military recruitment increasingly relied on men who had been brutalized in childhood or who came from populations that had already been terrorized by Roman warfare. This created armies composed of people who had been psychologically damaged by violence and were therefore more willing to inflict similar damage on others. The Romanization of conquered territories involved not just political control, but the systematic destruction of local military traditions and replacement with Roman methods of warfare. This meant that local populations gradually lost the knowledge and cultural frameworks needed for effective resistance while being indoctrinated into Roman methods of violence. Roman military law provided legal frameworks for atrocities that would be considered war crimes today. Soldiers had legal immunity for any actions taken against enemy populations, and officers were required to ensure that their troops engaged in sufficient brutality to maintain Roman military reputation for ruthlessness. The Roman triumph ceremony, where victorious generals paraded through Rome with their captured enemies, was a public celebration of systematic brutality. Prisoners would be displayed in chains, tortured for the entertainment of crowds, and then executed as the climax of the celebration. These ceremonies normalized mass violence and made it part of Roman civic culture. Roman military manuals included detailed instructions for conducting mass executions, organizing slave raids, and implementing scorched earth tactics. These weren't emergency measures or responses to particular situations. They were standard operating procedures that every Roman officer was expected to master. The provincial governors who administered conquered territories were typically former military officers who brought military methods of control to civilian administration. This meant that the same techniques used to terrorize enemies in warfare were applied to governing civilian populations, creating systems of control based on fear and violence. Roman road construction was as much about military control as transportation. Roman roads were designed to allow rapid movement of troops to suppress rebellions, and they often went through territories in ways that divided potential resistance movements and isolated communities from each other. The Roman postal system was primarily a military intelligence network designed to quickly communicate information about potential uprisings and coordinate military responses. The famous efficiency of Roman communication was built on systems designed to suppress resistance rather than facilitate commerce or culture. Roman military colonies were established not just to reward veterans, but to create permanent garrisons of brutalized soldiers in conquered territories. These colonies served as bases for continued terrorization of local populations and as training grounds for new generations of soldiers who would be raised in cultures of violence. The gladiator schools that supplied fighters for Roman entertainment were often staffed by military veterans who brought military discipline and brutality to the training of arena fighters. This created a direct connection between military conquest and entertainment violence that reinforced both systems of brutality. Roman military success created a feedback loop where the wealth generated by conquest funded larger and more brutal armies that could conquer additional territories. This expansion was only sustainable as long as there were new populations to conquer and enslave, which is why the Roman Empire eventually collapsed when it reached the limits of profitable expansion. The psychological impact of Roman warfare on the soldiers themselves was severe but largely ignored by Roman military leadership. Veterans of Roman campaigns often suffered from what we would now recognize as PTSD, but Roman culture provided no framework for understanding or treating psychological trauma caused by participation in systematic atrocities. The end of Roman military expansion came not from moral awakening, but from practical limits on the empire's ability to continue conquering and enslaving new populations. As the empire reached geographic boundaries where further expansion became unprofitable, the economic model based on conquest and enslavement began to collapse. The legacy of Roman military methods influenced European warfare for centuries, establishing precedents for systematic brutality that were later applied in colonial conquest and modern warfare. The Roman example showed how systematic violence could be organized, justified, and made sustainable as a basis for political and economic power. Roman politics wasn't a system of government. It was an organized crime syndicate where the most violent and corrupt individuals competed for the right to loot the empire while murdering anyone who threatened their power. What historians call the Roman Republic and Empire were actually sophisticated systems for concentrating wealth and power through legalized theft, murder, and exploitation. The Roman Senate, celebrated in modern times as an early form of democratic government, was actually a club of wealthy criminals who used their political positions to enrich themselves at the expense of everyone else. Senators weren't elected to serve the public good. They bought their positions through bribery, intimidation, and murder, then used their offices to recoup their investments through systematic theft from the state treasury and conquered territories. Roman elections were literally bought and sold in open markets, where candidates would bid against each other for blocks of votes. The voting system was designed to ensure that only the wealthy could participate meaningfully, while the poor were given just enough political participation to prevent total rebellion. The Campus Martius, where voting took place, was essentially an auction house where political power was sold to the highest bidder. Bribery wasn't just common in Roman politics. It was the primary mechanism through which the system operated. Candidates for office would spend enormous sums purchasing votes, bribing officials, and paying gangs to intimidate their opponents. These investments were recouped through corruption once the candidate took office, creating a cycle where political positions were treated as business ventures rather than public service. The Roman cursus honorum, or sequence of political offices, was designed as a pyramid scheme where each level required greater investment but offered greater opportunities for theft. Young aristocrats would bankrupt themselves buying lower offices, then use those positions to steal enough money to buy higher offices, continuing until they reached positions where they could loot entire provinces. Provincial governorships were essentially licenses to steal. Roman governors had absolute power over their territories and used it to extract enormous wealth through taxation, confiscation, and extortion. The standard practice was to arrive in a province with massive debts from buying the governorship, then extract enough wealth to pay off those debts, plus accumulate a fortune for retirement. The trial of Verus, documented by Cicero, provides a perfect example of standard Roman governmental corruption. Verus systematically looted Sicily for 3 years, stealing art treasures, extorting money from cities, and selling justice to the highest bidder. His corruption was so extreme that even by Roman standards it caused a scandal, but the trial revealed that his methods were typical rather than exceptional. Roman tax collection was organized theft on an industrial scale. The publicani system allowed private contractors to bid for the right to collect taxes in specific territories with the understanding that they could keep whatever they collected above their bid amount. This created incentives for tax collectors to extract as much wealth as possible from subject populations through any means necessary. These tax farmers used torture, kidnapping, and murder to extract payments from populations that often had no actual money to pay. Entire families would be enslaved to pay tax debts, and communities would be forced to sell their children to meet Roman tax demands. The publicani operated with complete legal immunity and were backed by Roman military force. The Roman legal system was a sophisticated mechanism for enabling theft and murder by the wealthy while providing the appearance of justice. Laws were written and interpreted to benefit the ruling class, while ordinary people had no effective legal protections. Justice was literally for sale, with court decisions going to whoever could afford the highest bribes. Roman trials were entertainment spectacles where wealthy defendants would hire professional orators to perform speeches designed to sway juries through emotion rather than evidence. The actual guilt or innocence of defendants was largely irrelevant compared to their wealth and political connections. Poor defendants had virtually no chance of acquittal regardless of the evidence. Political violence was routine and accepted as a normal part of Roman governance. Politicians regularly hired gangs of thugs to beat up their opponents, disrupt voting, and intimidate witnesses in trials. Murder of political rivals was common and usually went unpunished if the killer had sufficient wealth and connections. The career of Clodius Pulcher illustrates how political violence worked in Roman society. Clodius organized gangs that controlled Roman streets through intimidation and murder, used his political positions to enrich himself through extortion and theft, and eventually was murdered by a rival gang in what amounted to an open street battle between private armies. Roman politicians maintained private armies that were used to control territory, intimidate rivals, and suppress opposition. These weren't official military units, but personal forces funded through corruption and used to advance individual political careers. The line between politics and gangsterism was essentially non-existent. The first triumvirate between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus was a criminal conspiracy to divide the Roman Empire among 3 warlords who used their combined resources to eliminate opposition and loot the state treasury. This wasn't an official government arrangement, but a private agreement to share power and wealth while destroying anyone who threatened their interests. Crassus, the richest member of the triumvirate, made his fortune through methods that would be recognized today as organized crime. He maintained private fire brigades that would arrive at burning buildings and refuse to put out fires until the owners sold their property to Crassus at below market prices. He also used his political connections to have wealthy Romans declared enemies of the state so he could confiscate their property. Caesar's conquest of Gaul was essentially a private military campaign designed to generate enough wealth and military power to dominate Roman politics. The genocide of Gallic populations and enslavement of survivors weren't state policy, but Caesar's personal business ventures that funded his political ambitions. The Roman civil wars weren't conflicts over political principles, but gang wars between rival criminal organizations fighting for control of the empire's wealth. The rhetoric about defending the Republic or restoring traditional values was propaganda designed to justify what were essentially turf wars between competing mafia families. Augustus's rise to power marked the transition from competitive gangsterism to monopolistic control by a single criminal organization. The Praetorian Guard became the emperor's personal enforcement arm, while the imperial administration became a more efficient system for extracting wealth from the empire's population. Roman emperors weren't just political leaders, they were crime bosses who used state power to enrich themselves and their supporters while eliminating anyone who threatened their control. The imperial court was a nest of conspiracies where palace intrigue regularly resulted in murder, poisoning, and assassination. The Roman bureaucracy was designed to facilitate corruption rather than provide public services. Government positions were sold to the highest bidder, and office holders were expected to recoup their investments through theft and extortion. The more powerful the position, the more systematic the corruption it enabled. Roman law was written by and for the wealthy, creating legal frameworks that protected the interests of the ruling class while providing mechanisms for exploiting everyone else. Property rights were sacred when they benefited the wealthy, but could be ignored when the state wanted to confiscate assets from political enemies. The Roman citizenship system was designed to divide the population and prevent unified resistance to governmental exploitation. Different categories of citizenship carried different rights and protections, creating hierarchies that made collective action difficult while providing privileges that could be revoked for political reasons. Roman military recruitment was increasingly based on loyalty to individual commanders rather than the state, creating private armies that served the interests of their leaders rather than the public good. Soldiers were rewarded with loot from conquered territories and shares of enslaved populations, making military service essentially a form of organized robbery. The Roman grain dole wasn't a social welfare program, but a form of political bribery designed to prevent revolution by the urban poor. Free grain distributions kept potential rebels fed, while creating dependency on the government and providing opportunities for politicians to buy popular support. Roman public works projects were primarily mechanisms for transferring public resources to private contractors who had political connections. The magnificent buildings and infrastructure that tourists admire today were built through corrupt contracting processes that enriched the politically connected while exploiting enslaved workers. The Roman postal system and road network were designed primarily to facilitate governmental control and resource extraction rather than promote commerce or communication. These systems allowed rapid deployment of military forces to suppress rebellions and enabled efficient collection of taxes and tribute from conquered territories. Religious offices in Rome were political positions that were bought and sold like any other government post. The augurs and other religious officials who supposedly interpreted divine will were actually political operatives who manipulated religious ceremonies to support the interests of their wealthy patrons. Roman marriages among the elite were political alliances designed to consolidate wealth and power rather than personal relationships. Divorce and remarriage were used as tools of political strategy, with marriage contracts including specific provisions about how property would be divided and political support would be transferred. The Roman educational system was designed to prepare young aristocrats for careers in exploitation and violence rather than public service or intellectual development. Rhetoric training focused on manipulating emotions and obscuring truth rather than logical argument or ethical reasoning. Roman literature and philosophy served as propaganda tools that justified the exploitation and violence that characterized Roman society. Writers who produced works that supported the interests of the ruling class were rewarded with wealth and status, while those who criticized the system faced exile, imprisonment, or death. The Roman historical tradition was deliberately falsified to create mythologies that justified Roman expansion and exploitation. Historical accounts were written to portray Roman conquest as beneficial to conquered populations and Roman government as legitimate rather than predatory. Roman foreign policy was essentially a protection racket where neighboring states were forced to pay tribute to avoid being conquered and enslaved. Diplomatic relations were based on threats and extortion rather than mutual benefit or respect for sovereignty. The collapse of Roman government came not from external conquest, but from the internal contradictions of a system based on exploitation and violence. As the empire reached the limits of profitable expansion, the competition for diminishing resources led to increasingly destructive civil wars that eventually made centralized government impossible to maintain. The legacy of Roman politics influenced European governmental systems for centuries, establishing precedents for corruption, violence, and exploitation that were adapted to different historical circumstances. The Roman example showed how sophisticated administrative systems could be used to organize and legitimize systematic theft and oppression. Modern admiration for Roman political institutions reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of how those institutions actually functioned. The Roman Republic and Empire weren't models of good government, but examples of how political systems can be designed to serve the interests of a small elite while exploiting everyone else. Understanding the true nature of Roman politics is essential for recognizing how seemingly legitimate governmental institutions can be captured and corrupted by criminal organizations that use state power for private gain. The Roman example demonstrates that impressive architecture, sophisticated law codes, and efficient administration don't necessarily indicate just or beneficial government. Roman medicine wasn't healthcare. It was a systematic program of torture and poisoning that killed more people than it helped. What Romans called medical treatment would be recognized today as criminal assault, and their public health systems created conditions that guaranteed epidemic diseases would spread like wildfire through urban populations. Roman doctors had no understanding of basic anatomy, germ theory, or proper medical procedures. Their treatments were based on superstition, guesswork, and philosophical theories that had no basis in reality. The most respected Roman physicians were often the ones who inflicted the most suffering on their patients while charging the highest fees for their services. The fundamental theory underlying Roman medicine was the concept of humors, the belief that human health depended on balancing four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This theory was completely wrong, but it provided the basis for treatments that were designed to restore balance by removing excess fluids from patients through bleeding, purging, and other methods that weakened or killed them. Bloodletting was the most common Roman medical procedure, used to treat everything from headaches to broken bones. Roman doctors would open veins with crude knives or apply leeches to drain what they considered excess blood from patients. This treatment killed countless people by causing severe anemia, infection, and shock, but it remained popular because it sometimes appeared to provide temporary relief from symptoms. The bloodletting process itself was horrifically unsanitary. The same instruments were used on multiple patients without any cleaning or sterilization, spreading diseases like hepatitis and sepsis from person to person. Many patients died, not from their original conditions, but from infections contracted during bloodletting procedures. Roman surgical procedures were essentially controlled butchery performed without anesthesia or antiseptic precautions. Patients were held down by assistants, while surgeons cut into their bodies with crude instruments that were rarely cleaned between uses. The survival rate for major surgery was probably less than 30%. And those who survived often died later from post-surgical infections. Cataract surgery, which Romans practiced regularly, involved pushing the clouded lens back into the eye with a sharp instrument. This procedure was performed without anesthesia while the patient was fully conscious, and it often resulted in permanent blindness, brain damage, or death from infection. But it was considered a routine procedure that any Roman doctor could perform. Trepanation, drilling holes in patients' skulls, was used to treat headaches, mental illness, and epilepsy. Roman doctors would use crude drills to bore through the skull bone while patients were awake and aware, often causing brain damage, infection, or death. The survival rate for trepanation was extremely low, but it remained popular because Romans believed it allowed evil spirits to escape from the brain. Roman dental procedures were essentially torture sessions that caused more damage than they repaired. Tooth extraction was performed with crude pliers, while patients were held down by assistants. There was no anesthesia, no sterile equipment, and no understanding of proper extraction techniques. Many patients died from infection or shock after dental procedures. Roman doctors used toxic substances as routine medications that poisoned patients rather than curing them. Mercury was commonly prescribed for various conditions, causing neurological damage, kidney failure, and death. Lead compounds were used to treat everything from skin conditions to stomach problems, resulting in chronic lead poisoning that caused mental illness and organ failure. Antimony, arsenic, and other heavy metals were considered valuable medicines that were administered in doses that would be recognized today as lethal poisoning. Roman medical texts contain detailed instructions for preparing and administering these toxic substances with no understanding of their dangerous effects on human health. Roman gynecological practices were particularly horrific, based on the belief that women's health problems were caused by their wombs wandering around their bodies. Treatments included inserting burning herbs into the vagina, fumigating the uterus with toxic smoke, and performing crude surgical procedures on conscious patients without anesthesia. Childbirth in ancient Rome was a death sentence for many women, with maternal mortality rates probably exceeding 10%. Roman midwives had no understanding of sterile procedures, proper delivery techniques, or how to handle complications. Women who survived difficult births often suffered from permanent injuries, chronic pain, and disabilities that affected them for the rest of their lives. The Roman public health system was designed in ways that guaranteed the spread of infectious diseases. Public baths, which are often cited as evidence of Roman hygiene, were actually breeding grounds for disease where hundreds of people would soak in the same water that was rarely changed or properly cleaned. Roman bathhouses were hotbeds of infection, where people with open wounds, skin diseases, and contagious illnesses would share the same pools with healthy individuals. The warm, stagnant water provided perfect conditions for bacteria and parasites to multiply and spread from person to person. Many Romans contracted diseases at bathhouses that they then spread throughout their communities. The Roman sewage system, while impressive for its time, was poorly designed and maintained in ways that contaminated water supplies and spread disease. The Cloaca Maxima and other sewers regularly overflowed during heavy rains, flooding city streets with human waste and creating ideal conditions for cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases. Roman aqueducts, despite their architectural magnificence, delivered water through lead pipes that poisoned the population with chronic lead exposure. The wealthy, who had the most access to piped water, suffered the highest rates of lead poisoning, which may explain the erratic and violent behavior of many Roman aristocrats and emperors. Epidemic diseases swept through Roman cities regularly, killing thousands of people at a time. The Antonine Plague of 165 to 180 AD killed an estimated 5 million people across the empire, while the Plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century killed thousands daily in Rome alone. These epidemics were made worse by Roman medical practices that spread infection rather than controlling it. Roman doctors had no understanding of contagion or how diseases spread, so their treatments often made epidemics worse. They would move from patient to patient without washing their hands or changing their clothes, spreading infection throughout communities. The same instruments were used on multiple patients, turning medical practitioners into vectors for disease transmission. The Roman food supply was contaminated with toxins and adulterants that caused chronic illness and death. Bread was often made with flour that contained ergot fungus, causing ergotism, a condition that produced hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Wine was sweetened with lead compounds that caused chronic poisoning. Roman food preservation methods often resulted in spoiled or contaminated food that caused food poisoning and death. Fish sauce, garum, a staple of Roman cuisine, was made by allowing fish to rot in the sun for months, creating a product that was probably contaminated with dangerous bacteria and toxins. Mental illness in ancient Rome was completely misunderstood and brutally mistreated. People with psychological problems were thought to be possessed by demons or cursed by gods, and treatments included exorcism, beating, chaining, and starvation. Many mentally ill Romans were thrown into prison or sold into slavery, where they faced additional abuse and neglect. The Roman understanding of anatomy was based on animal dissection and philosophical speculation, rather than actual human dissection, which was largely prohibited. This meant that Roman doctors had no accurate knowledge of how the human body actually worked, leading to treatments that were often counterproductive or harmful. Roman medical schools taught theories and procedures that were completely wrong, creating generations of doctors who were trained to harm rather than heal their patients. The most prestigious medical training was available only to the wealthy, ensuring that the people who could afford the best doctors often received the most dangerous treatments. Roman military medicine was slightly more advanced than civilian healthcare because army doctors had extensive experience treating trauma and injuries, but even military medical care was primitive and dangerous. Battlefield surgery was performed without anesthesia or sterile procedures, and many soldiers died from infected wounds that could have been easily treated with modern methods. The Roman pharmaceutical industry was based on superstition and profiteering rather than effective treatment. Expensive medicines made from exotic ingredients were sold to wealthy patients, while cheaper remedies containing toxic substances were given to the poor. Many Roman medications were actually poisons that caused more harm than the original conditions they were meant to treat. Roman medical ethics were virtually non-existent, with doctors free to experiment on patients without consent or to abandon treatment when payment was not forthcoming. Poor patients were often used as test subjects for new procedures or medications, while wealthy patients received whatever treatments they could afford, regardless of their effectiveness or safety. The Roman medical profession was largely unregulated, allowing anyone to claim to be a doctor regardless of their training or competence. Many Roman physicians were charlatans who sold fake cures and performed dangerous procedures for profit, while others were genuinely trying to help, but lacked the knowledge to provide effective treatment. Roman hospitals, valetudinaria, were primarily military institutions designed to get soldiers back into battle as quickly as possible, rather than to provide comprehensive health care. Civilian hospitals were rare and poorly equipped, offering little more than basic shelter for sick people who often died from neglect or cross-infection. The Roman approach to public health was focused on impressive engineering projects like aqueducts and sewers, rather than on understanding and preventing disease. While these infrastructure projects were remarkable achievements, they were often poorly maintained and sometimes created new health hazards rather than solving existing problems. Roman medical literature consisted primarily of collections of recipes and procedures that had been passed down through generations without scientific testing or verification. Many Roman medical texts contained instructions for treatments that were guaranteed to harm or kill patients, but these texts were considered authoritative sources of medical knowledge. The Roman belief in divine intervention in health and disease meant that many sick people relied on religious rituals rather than medical treatment, often with fatal results. Temples to healing gods like Asclepius were filled with people seeking miraculous cures who died from lack of proper medical care. The end of Roman medicine came not through scientific advancement, but through the collapse of the empire itself. As Roman cities depopulated due to disease, war, and economic decline, the medical profession largely disappeared, leaving medieval Europe with even less medical knowledge than the Romans had possessed. The legacy of Roman medicine was almost entirely negative, establishing precedents for medical practices that caused more harm than good and delaying the development of scientific medicine for centuries. The Roman example shows how sophisticated civilizations can develop elaborate systems of medical treatment that are actually harmful to human health. Understanding the reality of Roman medicine helps explain why life expectancy in the Roman Empire was so low and why epidemic diseases were so devastating to Roman populations. The combination of ineffective medical treatment, poor public health infrastructure, and fundamental misunderstanding of disease created conditions where illness and death were constant companions for most Romans throughout their lives. The collapse of the Roman Empire wasn't a romantic fade into history. It was a catastrophic implosion that revealed the true cost of building a civilization on systematic exploitation, violence, and environmental destruction. The fall of Rome unleashed centuries of chaos, population collapse, and cultural destruction that showed what happens when unsustainable systems finally reach their breaking point. By the 3rd century AD, the contradictions inherent in Roman society had created a crisis so severe that the empire was literally falling apart from within. The system that had conquered the Mediterranean world through organized brutality had become so corrupt and unstable that it could no longer maintain control over its own territories. The crisis of the 3rd century saw the empire nearly collapse under the weight of its own dysfunction. In a 50-year period, Rome had over 50 emperors, most of whom died violent deaths from assassination, battle, or execution. The imperial government became a revolving door of military strongmen who seized power through violence and held it only until they were murdered by the next ambitious general. This political chaos wasn't just a leadership problem. It reflected the fundamental unsustainability of an economic system based on conquest and exploitation. As the empire reached its geographic limits, there were no new territories to conquer and enslave. Without fresh sources of wealth from military expansion, the economic model that had sustained Roman growth for centuries began to collapse. The debasement of Roman currency during this period shows how desperate the imperial government became. Emperors repeatedly reduced the silver content of coins to stretch their resources, creating inflation that destroyed the savings of ordinary Romans while enriching those who owned land and other real assets. By the end of the 3rd century, Roman coins contained less than 5% silver, making them essentially worthless tokens. The tax burden required to maintain the imperial government and military became so heavy that it destroyed the productive capacity of the empire. Roman taxation wasn't just extraction of surplus wealth, it was confiscation of the basic resources needed for survival. Entire cities were abandoned because their populations couldn't afford to pay Roman taxes while still maintaining themselves. The Diocletian reforms of the late 3rd century attempted to solve these problems by creating an even more oppressive system of government control. The empire was divided among multiple emperors, prices were fixed by government decree, and citizens were legally bound to their occupations and locations. These reforms temporarily stabilized the empire, but at the cost of turning the entire population into virtual slaves of the state. The rise of Christianity during this period wasn't a spiritual awakening, but a response to the complete failure of Roman civic culture. As traditional Roman institutions collapsed and the old gods seemed powerless to prevent disaster, people turned to new religious movements that promised salvation in an afterlife, since there was clearly no hope for improvement in this world. But Christianity's rise also contributed to the empire's fragmentation by creating new sources of conflict and division. Religious controversies became political battles that consumed enormous resources and energy that the empire could no longer afford to waste. The conversion of Constantine created a Christian empire that was fundamentally incompatible with the pagan traditions that had originally justified Roman expansion. The barbarization of the Roman military during the later empire shows how completely the original Roman system had broken down. The legions that had once conquered the Mediterranean were increasingly composed of foreign mercenaries who had no loyalty to Rome and no stake in preserving Roman civilization. These barbarian soldiers were often more civilized than the Romans they served. The sack of Rome by Visigoth leader Alaric in 410 AD traumatized the Roman world because it demonstrated that the Eternal City was just another conquest target. But the real horror wasn't the destruction caused by barbarian armies. It was the revelation that Roman civilization had become so weak and corrupt that it couldn't defend itself against forces that would have been easily defeated by earlier Roman armies. The Hunnic invasions under Attila created a cascade of population movements that overwhelmed the empire's ability to control its borders. But the Huns were successful, not because they were militarily superior to Romans, but because Roman society had become so dysfunctional that it couldn't organize effective resistance against external threats. The final collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD was almost anticlimactic because the imperial government had become so irrelevant that its disappearance barely affected daily life in most areas. The Germanic kingdoms that replaced Roman authority often provided better government and more security than the late Roman state had been able to offer. The population decline that accompanied the fall of Rome was catastrophic in scale. Archaeological evidence suggests that the population of Italy fell from perhaps 7 million in the 2nd century AD to less than 2.5 million by the 6th century. This wasn't just migration, it was demographic collapse caused by disease, warfare, and economic breakdown. The cities that had been the foundation of Roman civilization were largely abandoned during the collapse period. Rome itself shrank from over 1 million inhabitants to perhaps 50,000 people living among the ruins of buildings that no one knew how to maintain or repair. The urban culture that had defined Roman life for centuries simply disappeared. The The loss of technological knowledge during the Roman collapse was almost complete in many areas. The techniques for building aqueducts, roads, and large buildings were forgotten. The administrative systems that had managed complex economies and governments disappeared. Even basic literacy rates plummeted as schools closed and libraries were abandoned. The environmental consequences of Roman collapse were as dramatic as the human costs. Without maintenance, the drainage systems that had reclaimed agricultural land from swamps failed, turning productive farmland back into malaria-infested wetlands. The deforestation caused by Roman resource extraction had already destroyed many regional ecosystems, leaving landscapes that couldn't support large populations. The slave-based economy that had sustained Roman prosperity created social structures that couldn't adapt to changed circumstances. When military conquest ended, the supply of new slaves dried up, but Roman society had no experience with free labor systems that could replace slave-based production. The result was economic collapse as production systems simply shut down. The cultural impact of Roman collapse extended far beyond the territories that had been under direct Roman control. The trade networks that had connected Europe, Asia, and Africa were disrupted, causing economic problems across the known world. The intellectual traditions that had been preserved in Roman libraries and schools were lost, setting back human knowledge for centuries. The Dark Ages that followed the fall of Rome weren't called dark because historians were biased against medieval culture. They were dark because the collapse of Roman civilization had destroyed much of the accumulated knowledge and cultural achievement of the ancient world. It took centuries for European civilization to recover even basic capabilities that had been routine during the Roman period. The successor states that emerged from the ruins of the Roman Empire were often more humane and sustainable than Roman government had been, but they lacked the organizational capacity to maintain large-scale infrastructure or complex institutions. The medieval world that replaced Rome was in many ways more decent, but also more limited in its achievements. The Byzantine Empire, which preserved Roman institutions in the East, gradually evolved away from the brutal practices that had characterized the original Roman system. The survival of Byzantium for another 1,000 years after the fall of the West shows that Roman civilization could have been reformed rather than abandoned, but the Western Empire was too corrupt and dysfunctional to achieve such reforms. The Islamic world that conquered much of the former Roman territory often provided better government and more prosperity than Roman rule had delivered. The contrast between Islamic Spain and Visigothic Gaul, for example, shows how the collapse of Roman authority sometimes led to genuine improvements in human welfare. The romanticization of Rome by later civilizations, including our own, represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what Roman civilization actually achieved. The Renaissance admiration for Roman culture focused on architectural and literary achievements while ignoring the systematic brutality and exploitation that had made those achievements possible. The influence of Roman law on later European legal systems preserved some of the worst aspects of Roman civilization, including legal frameworks that supported slavery, authoritarian government, and systematic exploitation of conquered populations. Many of the legal precedents that justified European colonialism and slavery were derived from Roman legal traditions. The political legacy of Rome influenced the development of European monarchies and imperial systems that perpetuated many of the brutal practices that had characterized Roman government. The Holy Roman Empire, Napoleon's empire, and even modern dictatorships have drawn inspiration from Roman models of authoritarian control. The military legacy of Rome established precedents for systematic brutality and warfare that influenced European military practices for centuries. The Roman example showed how organized violence could be used to build and maintain political power, providing a model that was adapted by later conquerors and empire builders. The economic legacy of Rome created patterns of exploitation and resource extraction that influenced European colonial expansion and the development of global capitalism. The Roman model of extracting wealth from conquered territories through slavery and taxation was adapted and expanded by later European empires. The social legacy of Rome established precedents for systematic inequality and oppression that influenced European social structures for centuries. The Roman example showed how sophisticated legal and administrative systems could be used to maintain rigid social hierarchies and justify extreme inequality. The environmental legacy of Roman expansion and collapse shows what happens when civilizations exceed the carrying capacity of their ecosystems. The deforestation, soil depletion, and species extinctions caused by Roman resource extraction created environmental problems that persisted for centuries after the empire's fall. The demographic legacy of Roman collapse demonstrates the human cost of unsustainable civilizations. The population losses caused by the fall of Rome took centuries to recover, and some regions never regained their pre-collapse population levels. The social trauma caused by civilizational collapse affected European development for generations. The cultural legacy of Rome shows how the loss of accumulated knowledge and institutions can set back human progress for centuries. The collapse of Roman educational systems, libraries, and intellectual traditions created gaps in human knowledge that took generations to fill. The religious legacy of Rome demonstrates how civilizational crisis can transform spiritual and philosophical traditions. The rise of Christianity during the Roman collapse created new religious and cultural frameworks that replaced the pagan traditions that had originally justified Roman expansion. The technological legacy of Roman collapse shows how complex technologies and engineering capabilities can be lost when the social systems that support them break down. Many Roman technological achievements weren't equaled again until the Renaissance or later, demonstrating how civilizational collapse can cause long-term setbacks in human technological development. Understanding the true nature of Roman collapse helps explain why civilizations that seem powerful and permanent can suddenly disintegrate when their underlying contradictions become unsustainable. The Roman example shows that impressive achievements in architecture, military power, and administrative organization don't guarantee civilizational survival if the social and economic foundations are based on exploitation and environmental destruction. The ultimate lesson of Roman history isn't that great civilizations inevitably fall, but that civilizations built on systematic brutality and unsustainable exploitation carry the seeds of their own destruction. Rome's collapse wasn't caused by external enemies or natural disasters. It was the predictable result of a system that consumed human lives and natural resources faster than they could be replaced. Modern civilizations that study Roman history often focus on Rome's achievements while ignoring the human and environmental costs that made those achievements possible. This selective memory prevents us from learning the most important lessons that Roman history has to offer about the long-term consequences of building societies on foundations of violence and exploitation. Roman family life wasn't a source of love and protection. It was a miniature dictatorship where the oldest male had absolute power of life and death over everyone else, including the legal right to murder his own children, sell his family into slavery, or torture them for any reason he chose. The Roman concept of patria potestas gave fathers unlimited authority over their households that exceeded even the power of emperors over their subjects. A Roman father could legally kill his adult children, grandchildren, wives, and slaves without any legal consequences. This wasn't theoretical power. It was regularly exercised and celebrated as evidence of Roman virtue and discipline. Infanticide was not just legal in Roman society, it was routine and expected. Roman fathers had the right to examine newborn children and decide whether they would be allowed to live. Babies who were deemed unhealthy, deformed, or simply unwanted were left outside to die from exposure, starvation, or predation by wild animals. The process of infanticide was systematized and normalized. Midwives would present newborns to fathers immediately after birth, and fathers would either pick up the child to signify acceptance or turn away to signal rejection. Rejected babies would be carried outside the city and left in designated areas where they would die slowly over days while their parents went about their normal lives. Female infanticide was especially common because daughters were considered economic burdens who would require dowries and provide no labor or military service to their families. Many Roman families would keep only one daughter regardless of how many girls were born, killing the rest to avoid the expense of raising them. The psychological impact on Roman children who survived this selection process was devastating. Every Roman child grew up knowing that their parents had the legal right to kill them at any time for any reason. This created a culture of fear and submission within families that prepared children for the brutality they would face in the wider society. Roman children had no legal rights or protections whatsoever. They were considered the property of their fathers, who could sell them into slavery, lend them to other families as workers, or give them away as gifts. Children could be bought and sold like livestock, and many Roman children spent their lives working for families other than their biological parents. Child labor was universal in Roman society, with children as young as 4 or 5 being put to work in dangerous and exhausting jobs. Roman children worked in mines, factories, farms, and households, performing tasks that would be considered child abuse today. There was no concept of childhood as a protected period of development. Children were simply small adults who were expected to contribute economically to their families from the moment they could walk. The education of Roman children was designed to prepare them for lives of violence and exploitation rather than intellectual or moral development. Boys were taught to fight, compete, and dominate others, while girls were trained to be obedient and subservient. The curriculum focused on rhetoric and debate skills that would help students manipulate and deceive others rather than seeking truth or justice. Roman schools used corporal punishment as the primary teaching method. Children were regularly beaten with sticks, whips, and other implements for minor infractions like speaking out of turn or failing to memorize lessons correctly. Many Roman children suffered permanent injuries from school beatings, and some died from the severity of punishments administered by teachers. Sexual abuse of children was routine and legal in Roman society. Roman law permitted sexual relationships between adult men and boys, and child prostitution was a thriving industry that operated openly in Roman cities. Many Roman children were sold by their families into sexual slavery, where they faced years of abuse before being discarded when they became too old to attract customers. The Roman practice of adopting children was often a form of legalized human trafficking, where wealthy families would purchase children from poor families to use as workers or sexual objects. Adopted children had no more rights than slaves and could be abused, sold, or killed at the whim of their adoptive parents. Roman coming-of-age ceremonies were designed to indoctrinate young people into accepting violence and exploitation as normal parts of adult life. Boys would participate in gladiator fights, public executions, and military training that involved killing prisoners or animals. Girls would be married off to much older men in arrangements that were essentially legalized rape. Marriage in Roman society was a property transaction where women were transferred from their fathers to their husbands like valuable objects. Roman girls could be married as young as 12 years old to men who might be 40 or 50 years older. These marriages were consummated immediately, regardless of the girl's physical or emotional readiness for sexual activity. The high rate of death in childbirth meant that many Roman women died as teenagers after being forced into marriages and pregnancies that their bodies couldn't handle. The average Roman woman who survived to adulthood could expect to be pregnant or nursing for most of her reproductive years, with many dying from complications related to frequent pregnancies and childbirth. Roman divorce laws were designed to benefit men while leaving women and children with no protections or resources. Men could divorce their wives for any reason or no reason at all, keeping all property and children while leaving their ex-wives destitute. Women had virtually no grounds for divorce and could be abandoned by their husbands without any legal recourse. The Roman system of inheritance was designed to concentrate wealth in the hands of oldest sons while leaving younger children, especially daughters, with minimal resources. This created intense sibling rivalry and family conflict as children competed for their father's favor and the resources needed for survival. Roman families routinely sold their children into slavery when faced with economic difficulties. Parents would calculate the cost of raising children against the price they could get for selling them, and many chose to sell their children rather than face financial hardship. These transactions were conducted openly in slave markets where parents would negotiate prices for their own offspring. The emotional relationships within Roman families were stunted by the legal and economic structures that governed family life. Children learned to fear rather than love their parents, and parents viewed their children as investments or burdens, rather than individuals worthy of affection and protection. Roman child mortality rates were catastrophic, with an estimated 30 to 40% of children dying before age 5 and another 20 to 30% dying before reaching adulthood. These deaths were caused by disease, malnutrition, accidents, and abuse. But Roman families often viewed child death as economically beneficial because it reduced the cost of raising children to adulthood. The Roman practice of exposing sick or disabled children was considered virtuous rather than cruel. Parents who killed disabled children were praised for preventing their families from being burdened with unproductive members. This eugenics mentality created a society where human worth was measured entirely by economic productivity and physical capability. Roman child-rearing practices were designed to break children's spirits and make them subservient to authority. Children were subjected to constant criticism, physical punishment, and emotional abuse that was intended to eliminate any sense of self-worth or independence. The goal was to produce adults who would accept exploitation and abuse without resistance. The Roman legal system provided no protections for children who were abused or neglected by their families. Child abuse was considered a private family matter that was outside the jurisdiction of courts or government authorities. Children who tried to escape abusive families could be legally returned to their abusers and punished for attempting to leave. Roman entertainment often featured children as victims of violence and sexual abuse. Child gladiators were forced to fight and die in arenas for public amusement, while child prostitutes were displayed in brothels and sold to customers who specifically sought out young victims. These practices were legal and socially accepted forms of entertainment. The Roman economy was partially dependent on child labor and exploitation. Children worked in all sectors of the economy, performing dangerous and exhausting jobs for minimal compensation. Many Roman industries could not have operated profitably without access to cheap child workers who could be abused and discarded when they became injured or too old to work effectively. Roman military recruitment often targeted children who could be trained as soldiers from an early age. These child soldiers were subjected to brutal training regimens that included killing prisoners and participating in atrocities against civilian populations. Many child soldiers died during training or in their first battles, but they were considered expendable resources that could be easily replaced. The Roman foster care system was essentially a form of legalized child trafficking, where wealthy families would take in poor children as unpaid workers. These foster children had no legal protections and were often subjected to severe abuse, sexual exploitation, and dangerous working conditions that killed or permanently injured them. Roman religious practices often involved the sacrifice or abuse of children in ceremonies designed to appease gods or ensure divine favor. Children were killed in religious rituals, subjected to painful initiation ceremonies, and used as offerings in temple prostitution that was considered sacred rather than criminal. The Roman educational system was designed to perpetuate cycles of violence and exploitation by teaching children that brutality was normal and necessary. Students learned to view slaves, foreigners, and other vulnerable populations as legitimate targets for abuse and exploitation. This educational indoctrination ensured that each generation would continue the practices that had brutalized their parents. Roman literature and art often celebrated the abuse and exploitation of children as evidence of proper parental authority and social order. Stories that depicted fathers killing their children or families selling their offspring into slavery were held up as examples of virtue and self-sacrifice that other Romans should emulate. The psychological damage caused by Roman child-rearing practices affected entire generations of adults who had been traumatized in childhood and went on to traumatize their own children. This cycle of abuse created a society where violence and exploitation were normalized because most adults had never experienced healthy relationships or emotional security. Roman medical practices were particularly dangerous for children who were often used as test subjects for experimental treatments and procedures. Child patients received the most dangerous and least effective treatments because their lives were considered less valuable than those of adults. Many children died from medical treatments that would have been recognized as torture if applied to adult patients. The Roman legal concept of children as property rather than individuals with rights created precedents that influenced European and American legal systems for centuries. The idea that parents have absolute authority over their children and that children have no independent legal standing can be traced back to Roman legal traditions that treated children as objects rather than human beings. Understanding the reality of Roman family life and childhood helps explain how Roman society was able to normalize and perpetuate systematic brutality across generations. Children who grew up experiencing and witnessing constant violence and exploitation became adults who accepted these practices as natural and necessary, ensuring that Roman patterns of abuse would continue indefinitely. The end of Roman family practices came not through moral reform, but through the gradual collapse of the legal and economic systems that had supported them. As Roman authority weakened and Christian influence grew, alternative models of family life gradually replaced Roman practices, though many of the legal and cultural precedents established by Romans continued to influence European societies for centuries afterward. Roman women weren't citizens. They were legal property passed from father to husband like valuable livestock, with no rights, no legal protections, and no control over their own bodies, children, or lives. What modern people call the oppression of women doesn't even begin to describe the systematic dehumanization that Roman women endured from birth until death. Under Roman law, women were classified as perpetual minors, who could never achieve legal independence regardless of their age, intelligence, or capabilities. A Roman woman remained under the absolute control of her father until marriage, then became the legal property of her husband, and if widowed, would be placed under the guardianship of male relatives who controlled every aspect of her existence. Roman women could not vote, hold political office, own property independently, conduct business transactions, or even speak in court on their own behalf. They had no legal standing to sue for damages, seek divorce, or protect themselves from abuse. In the eyes of Roman law, women were objects rather than people, with legal status roughly equivalent to valuable livestock. The marriage system was designed as a transfer of property from one male owner to another, with the woman having no say in the arrangement. Roman girls could be betrothed as infants and married as soon as they reached puberty, typically around age 12 to 14, to men who might be decades older and completely unknown to them. These marriages were consummated immediately regardless of the girl's physical or emotional readiness for sexual activity. Roman law required wives to submit to their husband's sexual demands without question, and marital rape was not just legal, but expected as part of a wife's duties. Women who resisted their husband's sexual advances could be beaten, divorced, or killed without legal consequences. The primary purpose of Roman marriage was to produce legitimate male heirs who could inherit property and continue the family name. Women who failed to produce sons were often divorced and discarded, regardless of how many daughters they had borne. The pressure to produce male children led many women to undergo dangerous medical procedures or consume toxic substances that were supposed to influence the sex of their babies. Roman women spent most of their adult lives pregnant or nursing, with the average woman experiencing 6 to 8 pregnancies if she survived to menopause. The high maternal mortality rate meant that many women died in childbirth before age 25, but those who survived faced a lifetime of physical damage from repeated pregnancies and dangerous deliveries. Roman obstetric care was primitive and often lethal. Midwives had no understanding of sterile procedures, proper delivery techniques, or how to handle emergencies. Women gave birth in unsanitary conditions using crude instruments and toxic medications that often killed both mother and child. Cesarean sections were performed only when the mother was already dead, as the procedure was invariably fatal with Roman medical techniques. The legal doctrine of patria potestas gave husbands absolute power over their wives, including the right to kill them for suspected adultery, disobedience, or simply displeasure. Roman men could murder their wives without trial or legal proceedings, and such killings were often celebrated as examples of proper masculine authority and family discipline. Roman divorce laws were designed to benefit men while leaving women destitute and powerless. Men could divorce their wives for any reason or no reason at all, keeping all property, children, and assets, while sending their ex-wives back to their families with nothing. Women had virtually no grounds for initiating divorce and could be abandoned by their husbands without warning or explanation. When Roman women did manage to obtain divorces, they lost all rights to their children, who legally belonged to their fathers. Many women were forced to choose between staying in abusive marriages or losing all contact with their children forever. This legal structure trapped women in dangerous relationships where they had no recourse against violence or exploitation. The Roman dowry system was designed to transfer wealth from women's families to their husbands, while providing no security or protection for the women themselves. Dowries became the property of husbands upon marriage, and women had no legal claim to recover these assets, even if their marriages ended. This system encouraged men to marry and divorce multiple women to accumulate wealth through confiscated dowries. Roman women who remained unmarried were considered failures and social outcasts who brought shame to their families. Single women had no legal standing and no means of economic survival except through prostitution or begging. The pressure to marry was so intense that families would often accept abusive or unsuitable husbands rather than allow their daughters to remain single. Wealthy Roman women were expected to remain in their homes at all times, except for specific religious or social occasions. They were not allowed to appear in public without male escorts, could not attend political gatherings or legal proceedings, and were forbidden from participating in most aspects of Roman civic life. This isolation was enforced through physical confinement and social ostracism of women who violated these restrictions. The Roman beauty standards imposed on women were designed to emphasize their status as sexual objects rather than human beings. Women were expected to remove all body hair, wear elaborate makeup and jewelry, and maintain artificially pale skin through the use of toxic lead-based cosmetics that caused chronic poisoning, mental illness, and early death. Roman women's clothing was designed to restrict their movement and emphasize their sexual availability. The stola and other female garments were heavy, uncomfortable, and impractical for any kind of physical activity. Women were literally wrapped in cloth in ways that made independent action difficult while displaying their bodies for male evaluation and consumption. The Roman entertainment industry was built on the systematic sexual exploitation of women who were forced into prostitution, exotic dancing, and other forms of commercial sexual service. Female slaves were routinely used as entertainers at private parties, where they were expected to provide sexual services to guests as part of the evening's entertainment. Roman brothels were legal businesses that operated openly throughout the empire, offering services ranging from basic prostitution to elaborate sexual performances and torture shows. Women in these establishments had no legal protections and could be subjected to any form of abuse the customers were willing to pay for. Many prostitutes died from injuries, diseases, or violence inflicted by their customers. The Roman practice of temple prostitution combined religious observance with sexual exploitation, forcing women to serve as sacred prostitutes who provided sexual services as part of religious ceremonies. These women were often slaves who had been dedicated to temples as children and spent their entire lives providing sexual services to worshippers. Roman law permitted fathers to sell their daughters into prostitution and husbands to rent out their wives for sexual services. These transactions were conducted openly and legally, with the profits going to the male family members who owned the women. Many Roman families supplemented their income by forcing their female relatives into prostitution. The Roman military system was partially dependent on sexual slavery, with armies accompanied by large numbers of women who were forced to provide sexual services to soldiers. These camp followers had no legal protections and were considered disposable resources that could be abandoned or killed when armies moved on to new campaigns. Roman women who attempted to assert independence or resist their assigned roles faced severe punishment, including beating, imprisonment, forced labor, or execution. The legal system provided no recourse for women who were abused by their families or husbands, and society actively discouraged any form of female resistance or self-assertion. The Roman religious system reinforced women's subordinate status by portraying female deities as either virginal and sexless or dangerous and destructive. Roman mythology was filled with stories of women being punished by gods for attempting to exercise power or independence, reinforcing social messages about the dangers of female autonomy. Roman medical theory held that women were inherently defective and diseased, with female anatomy being viewed as a malformed version of male bodies. This medical misogyny justified treatments that were designed to control and punish women rather than heal them, including painful procedures that were inflicted specifically because women were thought to deserve suffering. The Roman educational system excluded most women from formal learning, keeping them ignorant of law, politics, literature, and other subjects that might enable them to understand or challenge their oppression. Women who did receive education were taught skills that would make them more valuable as wives and mothers, rather than knowledge that would enable independent thought or action. Roman women who showed signs of intelligence or independence were often labeled as witches or unnatural beings who posed threats to the social order. These women faced persecution, exile, or execution for violating social expectations about proper female behavior. The accusation of witchcraft was commonly used to eliminate women who challenged male authority. The Roman inheritance system was designed to prevent women from accumulating or controlling wealth. Even when women technically inherited property, it was managed by male guardians who controlled how the assets were used. This system ensured that economic power remained concentrated in male hands, regardless of formal ownership arrangements. Roman women who survived to old age often faced abandonment by their families, who viewed elderly women as economic burdens with no productive value. Many elderly Roman women died in poverty and neglect because their families had no incentive to care for them once they could no longer reproduce or provide domestic labor. The Roman legal concept of women as property rather than persons created precedents that influenced European legal systems for centuries. Many of the legal disabilities that affected women in medieval and early modern periods can be traced directly to Roman legal traditions that denied women basic human rights and autonomy. Roman art and literature consistently portrayed women as either idealized objects of beauty or dangerous sources of chaos and destruction. There were few representations of women as complete human beings with their own thoughts, feelings, and motivations. This cultural dehumanization reinforced legal and social systems that treated women as objects rather than people. The Roman practice of female infanticide was so common that it significantly skewed the population-sex ratio, creating a society where women were scarce and therefore more valuable as property. This scarcity increased rather than decreased the exploitation of women, as it made them more valuable commodities in marriage and slave markets. Roman women's limited access to contraception and abortion meant that they had no control over reproduction beyond abstinence, which was rarely an option for married women. The few contraceptive and abortifacient methods available were dangerous and often fatal, leading many women to die from attempts to control their fertility. The Roman system of concubinage allowed wealthy men to maintain multiple sexual partners while denying these women any legal recognition or protection. Concubines had no rights to property, children, or legal protection, and could be discarded at any time without compensation or support. Roman wet nursing practices often separated mothers from their infants, forcing poor women to nurse the children of wealthy families while their own babies were neglected or died from malnutrition. This system created additional trauma for women who were forced to choose between their own children's welfare and economic survival. The Roman practice of exposure, abandoning unwanted infants, disproportionately affected female babies, who were more likely to be abandoned than males. Many of these abandoned girls were collected by slave dealers and raised specifically for prostitution, creating a pipeline that fed the sexual exploitation industry with a constant supply of victims. Roman women had no legal recourse against domestic violence, marital rape, or other forms of abuse within their families. The concept of privacy within the household meant that male family members could abuse female relatives without interference from authorities, and women were expected to endure any treatment their male relatives chose to inflict. The end of Roman women's oppression came not through social reform or women's resistance, but through the gradual transformation of legal and social systems during the empire's decline. Christian influence slowly introduced alternative models of women's roles, though many Roman legal and cultural precedents continued to influence the treatment of women for centuries afterward. Understanding the reality of Roman women's lives helps explain how supposedly civilized societies can systematically dehumanize half their population while maintaining elaborate legal and cultural justifications for oppression. The Roman example shows how legal systems, religious beliefs, and social customs can work together to create comprehensive systems of control that reduce human beings to property and deny them basic dignity and autonomy. Roman religion wasn't spiritual worship. It was systematic human sacrifice disguised as piety, where gods demanded blood offerings and religious ceremonies involved torture, murder, and ritualized violence that would shock modern people with its deliberate cruelty and sadistic creativity. The Roman pantheon was essentially a collection of divine psychopaths who required constant appeasement through human suffering. These weren't benevolent deities offering comfort and guidance. They were cosmic bullies who threatened disaster unless provided with regular offerings of human blood, pain, and death. Human sacrifice was routine in Roman religious practice, though it was often disguised as other activities to make it seem more civilized. The gladiator games were fundamentally religious ceremonies where humans were killed as offerings to gods, with the arena serving as a sacred space where divine beings consumed the life force of dying fighters. The Roman practice of decimation, killing every 10th soldier in units that showed cowardice, was explicitly framed as a religious ritual where the gods of war were appeased through the sacrifice of Roman blood. Military commanders would conduct these executions with full religious ceremony, including prayers and offerings that portrayed the killings as sacred duties rather than military discipline. Roman religious festivals regularly included human sacrifices that were carried out with elaborate ritual procedures designed to maximize the victim's suffering for the gods' pleasure. The Saturnalia, despite being remembered today as a joyful celebration, included ritual murders of slaves and prisoners who were killed in ways that supposedly honored Saturn's appetite for human flesh. The Roman cult of Mithras, popular among soldiers, required initiates to participate in ritual killings of both animals and humans as part of their religious advancement. Mithraic ceremonies took place in underground temples where new members would torture and kill victims, while senior cult members chanted prayers and consumed the blood of the dying. Roman funeral practices often included human sacrifice on a massive scale, with wealthy Romans being buried along with dozens or hundreds of slaves who were killed specifically to serve their masters in the afterlife. These funeral sacrifices were conducted with full religious ceremony and were considered essential for ensuring the deceased's comfort in the underworld. The Roman practice of crucifixion was explicitly designed as a form of human sacrifice that would appease gods while terrorizing living populations. Crucified victims were left to die slowly over days, while priests conducted ceremonies beneath the crosses, collecting the victim's blood and final breaths as offerings to various deities. Roman religious law required regular human sacrifices to maintain divine favor for the empire. Official state religion included scheduled executions of prisoners, slaves, and condemned criminals who were killed in elaborate rituals that were supposed to ensure military victory, good harvests, and protection from natural disasters. The Roman celebration of victory in warfare always included massive human sacrifices where captured enemies were tortured and killed in honor of Mars and other war gods. These religious ceremonies could last for days, with thousands of prisoners being killed in progressively more creative ways to demonstrate the Romans' gratitude to their divine patrons. Roman mystery religions, which attracted followers from all social classes, centered around ritual participation in human sacrifice and torture. Initiates were required to prove their devotion by personally killing victims, often using their bare hands or crude weapons to make the deaths more intimate and meaningful as religious experiences. The Roman cult of Cybele required male priests to castrate themselves with sacred knives during religious ceremonies, often bleeding to death in front of cheering crowds who viewed these self-mutilations as evidence of genuine religious devotion. The severed genitals were offered to the goddess as proof of the priest's commitment to serving her. Roman household religion included regular sacrifices of family members who were killed to appease household gods and ensure domestic prosperity. Children, elderly relatives, and slaves were routinely murdered during family religious ceremonies that were considered essential for maintaining divine protection of the home. The Roman practice of taking auspices, reading divine will through the behavior of birds and other animals, often required the torture and killing of creatures in ways that would produce specific types of pain responses that priests could interpret as divine messages. These divination ceremonies involved systematic animal cruelty that was justified as necessary communication with gods. Roman religious prostitution forced women and children to provide sexual services as part of worship ceremonies, with temple prostitutes being subjected to ritual abuse that was supposed to transfer their suffering to the gods. These religious sexual practices often resulted in the death of participants from injuries, disease, or exhaustion. The Roman calendar was organized around religious festivals that required specific types of human sacrifice, creating a year-long cycle of ritualized killing that consumed thousands of lives annually. Each month brought new religious obligations that could only be fulfilled through the torture and murder of designated victims. Roman military religion required soldiers to participate in ritual killings before battles, during campaigns, and after victories. Warriors were expected to dedicate enemy deaths to their patron gods and to conduct battlefield sacrifices that involved the systematic torture of captured enemies who were killed in ways that supposedly honored divine preferences. The Roman practice of burying people alive was conducted as a religious ceremony honoring chthonic deities who were thought to prefer victims who died slowly underground. These burials were carried out with full religious ritual, including prayers and offerings that accompanied the victims as they were sealed into underground chambers where they would suffocate over days. Roman religious law included detailed prescriptions for conducting human sacrifices, specifying which types of victims should be used for different gods, what methods of killing were most appropriate for various ceremonies, and how the bodies should be disposed of to ensure maximum divine satisfaction. The Roman interpretation of natural disasters always involved human sacrifice as a response to divine anger. Earthquakes, floods, famines, and epidemics were attributed to insufficient blood offerings, leading to massive sacrificial ceremonies where hundreds or thousands of people were killed to appease the angry gods. Roman religious education taught children that human suffering was pleasing to gods and that participating in torture and murder was a sacred duty rather than a crime. Young Romans learned to view ritual killing as a normal and necessary part of civilized life, preparing them for adult participation in systematic religious violence. The Roman system of religious slavery created entire classes of people who existed solely to be killed in religious ceremonies. These sacrificial slaves were bred, raised, and trained specifically for ritual murder, with their entire lives being organized around their eventual deaths in service to the gods. Roman religious architecture was designed specifically to facilitate human sacrifice, with temples including specialized chambers for torture, killing areas with drainage systems for blood, and viewing areas where audiences could watch victims die while participating in religious ceremonies. The Roman priesthood was essentially a professional class of ritual killers who specialized in different methods of human sacrifice and torture. Priests were trained in techniques for maximizing victim suffering, prolonging death agonies, and extracting maximum religious value from each killing ceremony. Roman religious texts included detailed instructions for conducting human sacrifices with specific prayers, rituals, and procedures that were supposed to ensure that killings would be acceptable to the gods. These religious manuals were treated as sacred documents that provided authoritative guidance for ritual murder. The Roman practice of religious warfare involved dedicating entire enemy populations to gods through systematic extermination campaigns that were conducted as extended religious ceremonies. These holy wars were designed to provide gods with massive blood offerings while eliminating potential threats to Roman power. Roman religious festivals often featured competitive human sacrifice, where priests would compete to devise the most creative and painful methods of killing victims. These competitions were viewed as sacred contests that honored the gods while demonstrating the priest's devotion and skill in ritual murder. The Roman interpretation of illness and disease involved human sacrifice as both cause and cure, with sick people being required to participate in ritual killings that were supposed to transfer their illnesses to sacrificial victims. These medical ceremonies often killed both the original patients and the sacrificial victims. Roman religious law required specific types of human sacrifice to consecrate new buildings, with construction projects including the ritual murder of workers, slaves, or prisoners, whose deaths were supposed to ensure structural stability and divine protection of the completed structures. The Roman practice of religious divination often involved the torture and killing of human victims whose death agonies were interpreted as divine messages. Professional diviners would systematically torture people while reading religious significance into their screams, convulsions, and final words. Roman marriage ceremonies included ritual elements that involved the symbolic or actual sacrifice of human beings, with wedding celebrations often culminating in the killing of slaves or prisoners who were murdered to ensure divine blessing of the new union. Roman religious responses to military defeat always involved massive human sacrifices designed to appease gods who were thought to have abandoned Rome due to insufficient blood offerings. These post-defeat ceremonies could consume thousands of lives in single events that were supposed to restore divine favor. The Roman system of religious taxation included requirements for families to provide human victims for sacrifice, with households being required to surrender family members or slaves for ritual killing as part of their religious obligations to the state and gods. Roman religious colonies were established specifically to provide steady supplies of sacrificial victims for major religious centers, with entire communities being organized around the breeding and preparation of humans who would be killed in religious ceremonies at designated temples. The Roman practice of religious medicine involved the systematic torture and killing of patients as treatments for various conditions, with doctors and priests working together to conduct healing ceremonies that typically resulted in the death of everyone involved. Roman religious responses to natural phenomena like eclipses, comets, and unusual weather patterns always involved human sacrifice, with astronomical events being interpreted as divine demands for blood offerings that could only be satisfied through ritual murder. The Roman religious calendar included seasonal human sacrifices that were timed to correspond with agricultural cycles, with planting and harvest seasons, requiring the deaths of specific numbers of people whose blood was supposed to ensure divine blessing of crops. Roman religious law included provisions for the sacrifice of entire families when serious crimes or disasters occurred, with collective punishment taking the form of ritual murder that was supposed to cleanse communities of divine displeasure through the elimination of contaminated bloodlines. The decline of Roman religion came not through moral reform, but through the practical impossibility of maintaining the massive infrastructure required for systematic human sacrifice. As the empire's resources became strained, the cost of conducting regular ritual murders became prohibitive, leading to the gradual abandonment of practices that had defined Roman spirituality for centuries.